I want to thank the Aquinas Center for hosting this and really for all of you taking your time to be here. I know everyone has a lot of things going on in the middle of the week. I've spent a lot of the past year on the road sharing untold stories from the global migrant and refugee crisis, and I've been continually encouraged by seeing how many people make an effort to come out, students and community members, people who are really eager to learn and to engage and discuss and to be a part of the solution. We are at this moment in the middle of the largest humanitarian crisis that we'll face in our lifetimes. And I think it's critical that we start discussing how we as a local community will be a part of stepping up to serve the global community, especially those who have been forced to flee their homes across the world. As Sister Mary mentioned in her kind introduction, I am a professor of anthropology and also film studies here at Emory. And for as long as I can remember now, my driving passion has been defending the rights of those who have been forced to flee their homes from conflict and from poverty, those who no longer have a country that will guarantee their basic human rights. Before I jump into the first part of my presentation, I want to ask a couple of questions to get a sense of what the audience is following in the news these days. Is it safe to assume that most people gathered here have at some point in the past couple of months read stories about or seen images of the migrant and refugee crisis that's unfolding in Europe? Just a show of hands. Okay. What about the migrant and refugee crisis that's unfolding at our own border with Mexico? Is that something that's in your news cycle? Okay. So both of these crises are things that have been difficult for most of us to avoid in the everyday news, but tonight what I'm going to do is pull your attention away from those crises and invite you to step inside of another story that's unfolding just beyond Europe's southernmost borders in North Africa. This is the untold story of Africa's migrant and refugee crisis. Despite the lack of coverage that it receives, there are more than 4 times the number of men, women, and children trapped at those borders than in any other world region right now. I know it's hard for us to imagine when we gather together in a beautiful space like this, that right now in the world, there are 68.6 million people who don't have a country to call home. It's hard to even know what 68.6 million people looks like. To give you a sense of the magnitude, that's about 1 in every 100 people in the world who's been forced to flee home just in the past year. And over half of them are children under the age of 18. Before I show you a trailer from my latest documentary film project, The Burning, I'd like to ask everyone here in the room to take a couple of minutes to step outside of this space and to step into the journeys that migrants and refugees around the world are living right now. To help us make this leap, I'm going to draw on the words of a poem called Home by Warsan Shire, who's a writer and a Somali refugee herself. She wrote these powerful words when she was only 20 years old. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running too. Your neighbors running faster than you. The boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, he's forced to carry a gun bigger than his body now. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. It's not something you ever thought about doing. And so when you do, you carry your anthem quietly under your breath, tearing up and burning each page of your passport, making it clear that you will never be going back. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Who would choose to spend days and nights locked in the stomach of a hot truck unless the miles traveled meant more than the journey? No one would choose to climb over razor wire fences to be beaten until even your own shadow leaves you, raped, drowned, forced to the bottom of the boat because you are darker, to be sold, enslaved, starved, shot at the border like a sick animal, lose your name, lose your family. See if you can make a refugee camp a home for a year or 2 or maybe 10. Stripped and searched, you find prison everywhere you go. And if you survive, you're greeted on the other side with "Go home, blacks," refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry of milk, dark, with your hands out, smell strange, look strange, something savage. Look what they've done to their own countries. What will they do to ours? But the dirty looks in the street are a little softer than a limb torn off. The indignity of your everyday life, a little more tender than men who look something like your father between your legs. Insults, they're easier to swallow than rubble, than your child's body in pieces at your feet. For now, you forget about your pride. Your survival is all that matters. I want to go home, but my home is the mouth of a shark. My home is the barrel of a gun. No one would leave home until home chased you to the shore, telling you, leave what you cannot carry on your back behind, even if it is human. Don't you understand? No one leaves home until home is a dark voice in your ear saying, "Run from me now. I don't know what I've become." So what you all saw there is a trailer for what will be a feature-length documentary film released to audiences around the world in 2020. It follows the journeys of 3 groups who were coming from the DRC, Sierra Leone, and Mali over the course of 3 years, or 9,000 miles of their journey. I wrapped this last shoot for this project this past summer, and I'm really excited to be able to give you all this exclusive look behind the scenes of it as we near completion. My research as an anthropologist for the past decade now has centered on international human rights, on how they're applied equally and oftentimes unequally to different populations around the world depending on the country that they were born in. When I'm not here at Emory teaching classes, I've spent much of the past decade on the ground in North Africa, in Morocco, Libya, and Algeria, where, as you all now know, the world's largest population of migrants and refugees is currently trapped. I believe that combining my work as a researcher and a filmmaker allows me to humanize what have become highly politicized issues. Film has the power to remind us that even in the masses, even in 68.6 million people, there is still the story of one boy. We can take, for instance, this boy right here, named Alsani Diallo. Among his brotherhood, Alsani's better known as Bambino because he's so scrawny for his age. I first met him 3 summers ago on one of my first film shoots. He was 12 years old, and he had just arrived to our hidden forest camp, fresh off a 3,000-mile journey across the continent. To give you a sense of that journey, Atlanta to Seattle is about 2,500, and he was traveling on his own. As the eldest son in his family, it was Bambino's responsibility to care for his younger brothers and sisters when they lost both of their parents to war. But as he explains to me, his country offered him no way of providing a safe future for his siblings, and so he was forced to find another home for them. I had no choice, he tells me. He's on food duty this night, so he's preparing one meal that he and his brotherhood will share that day. I could stay there and watch my little brothers and sisters die, or I could leave and try to find a new home for us. A home where they might be able to go to school for the first time, where I might be able to find a job and finally feed us well. First, I traveled to the bigger cities, but they weren't any better than my village, so I traveled past my country's borders. I'd never left my village before, and suddenly I was alone in a foreign country. I walked for days and hid in the backs of smugglers' trucks. I slept on the streets and begged for change. I met many other boys who had left their homes in search of safety. It seemed like no countries wanted us, and so we kept traveling north. Now we're here at the final border. We've all traveled so far, and we've sacrificed so much. You can ask any of us, and we'll tell you the same thing. We'll make it to Europe, or we'll die trying. For us, there's only one way home. The average age in the camps where I work is 16 years old. And Bambino's story, the story of being the eldest son who has lost his parents and has the burden of caring for the family, is the most common story that I hear. Morocco's the single most trafficked border in the world right now. For those of you who might not be as familiar with the region, it's the closest African country to Europe by water. It's just over 8 miles from Morocco to southern Spain. But on top of that, Morocco is still home to 2 colonial-era Spanish enclaves called Ceuta and Melilla. One of them is pictured here. These enclaves, which are only about 4 and 7 square miles in size, make Morocco the only place on the entire African continent where you find a land border to an internally borderless EU. These enclaves are now surrounded by not only 1, but 3 20-foot-high razor wire fences, which have deep trenches dug between each one. Morocco's critical location makes it the primary crossing point for people coming from all across the continent, fleeing war and poverty. After traveling thousands of miles, migrants like Bambino attempt to use it as a launching pad in one of 3 different ways. Most commonly, as it's the one option that requires no money, so you don't have to pay a smuggling ring in order to do it, it's by scaling these rings of fences around the enclaves. They band together in large groups, hoping that a few of them will be able to evade the guards waiting on the other side. Those with slightly more resources at hand pool together all of the money they have in order to purchase inflatable rafts with an outboard motor. They pay smugglers to give them the route, which is really just the right to cross, and they self-captain these small boats across the rough waters of the Mediterranean in the middle of the night. Another option for those with some resources at hand has been stowing away in these specially constructed cages and vehicles that are crossing in to European territory. But this particular practice has gotten really difficult in the past couple of months because all of the border checkpoints are now equipped with sonic devices that they attach to the hoods of every vehicle, allowing them to check for the number of heartbeats inside. So according to our Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all citizens of the world, every single one of us in the room right now, regardless of the country we were born in, we're all guaranteed a couple of rights. And one of the most foundational among them is the right for us to seek refuge in another country if we're no longer safe in our own. But what many people don't understand about the way that our international laws operate is that in order to gain refugee status, you first have to reach a country where the United Nations Refugee Agency is operating. After you arrive to one of these countries, you should, in theory, then begin a long, complicated, and highly subjective application process. Refugee status is not unlimited. The number of people given status every year is determined by quotas that every individual country sets. So the US sets a quota saying this year we will accept what happens to be a record low of 17,000 refugees. This means that those who survive these treacherous journeys not only have to prove that their cases are worthy of getting status, those individuals have to prove that their story is more deserving of status than all the other stories that will be heard by the caseworker that day. The average time that they're given to do this is less than 5 minutes. It's also important to note that our international human rights laws were established fairly recently. They came out of a post-World War II Europe. They were created to deal with the large numbers of Jewish families who had been displaced from their homes and no longer felt safe returning to their countries even after the war had ended. These laws were never meant to deal with displacement on a global scale. And they were also never meant to last as long as they have. So one way to deal with a growing crisis of refugees is to stop people from ever becoming refugees in the first place. And this is exactly what's being done through a process that I call border externalization. In the EU, billions of euros are being spent every year to keep Africans, the world's largest population of migrants, out of Europe so they never have the chance to apply for status. I'm not going to spend too much time on the details here, but I just want to note that this practice isn't happening in Europe alone. We can see it in other world regions. We can see it in Australia, their policies with the barrier islands around Australia, and we can see it in our own country, in our agreements with Mexico to keep South and Central American asylum seekers from reaching our own borders. Border externalization works through political agreements in which wealthy countries like the US, Australia, and those across the EU pay poorer countries on their periphery. In exchange for those payments, the countries are expected to become permanent detention centers for people who are seeking safer shores. It is no coincidence that these holding cells are almost always located in places where foreign media is tightly controlled. In the case of North Africa, where I work, foreign media is banned altogether. As human rights violations grow more pervasive, I've watched as every single one of the international aid organizations that used to be on the ground there serving the most vulnerable, organizations like the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders, they have also been banned. With no official camps, it means that the millions who are currently trapped in North Africa are left alone in these hidden forest camps with no access to basic social services. They're left alone to deal with everything from infections that need antibiotics to childbirth. But operating on foreign soil, with foreign media banned from the country and international aid organizations banned from the country, means that European officials can get away with abuse that is punishable under European and international law. That is why this project is so powerful. For the first time, people will see what's actually happening in these spaces. Over the years, I've been hired by multiple major news organizations, first BBC and later Vice, to break the news of the EU's illegal practices in North Africa. I took both jobs. Both ended up giving up the story in less than 3 months because of the incredible difficulty and danger of telling it. It was around that time, in 2015, when Vice pulled the plug on the project, that I knew if I wanted to break this story, I would have to work alone and I would have to work undercover. My work has revealed that across North Africa, migrants are commonly rounded up and taken to detention centers where they spend an average of 10 years working off their sentences like modern-day slaves. My recent footage out of Libya reveals how migrants there are now being sold in open markets to combat the overcrowding of their detention centers. The average price for a human in Libya right now is $400. Those who escape this trade, they retreat to these hidden forest camps in the mountains around Morocco's Spanish enclaves, where on any given day, right now, at this moment, we could find hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. In these camps, their life centers around training for their next attempted escape. It was in one of these camps that I first met Bambino, who was part of a brotherhood that was made up of hundreds of other young boys just like him. As an anthropologist, I believe that in order to tell someone's story well, you have to live it. And so I've lived alongside these groups for the past 3 years, spending every moment that I'm not teaching or in the community raising awareness, working on this project, which is a passion project of mine. I've lived alongside the families whose journeys I've captured, Bambino and this group of brothers who were orphaned in Sierra Leone and Guinea. Kia, who's pictured here, with her 2 young children before leaving their home in Mali. And Fino, whose journey began with his wife and child in the DRC. My own journey to create The Burning has meant days traversing deserts on foot, weeks in the backs of smugglers' trucks, and months spent sleeping on the forest floor. In our camps, food is scavenged from the trash, water supplies are always scarce, and I've never spent more than a week without a routine police raid decimating whatever supplies we've amassed and capturing those who are found. I'm not immune to these raids when I'm in the camps. My journey to create The Burning has meant my own imprisonment and torture. It has meant the repeated loss of equipment and nearly half of the footage that I've shot over the past 3 years destroyed. It has meant starting this project again and again and again. But it's also meant that I have forged the deepest of bonds with these 3 families who are trusting me to share their stories with the world. And I will not stop until their voices have been heard. The next clip that I'm going to show you will allow you to hear one of these voices for yourself. One of the voices behind this film. 7-year-old Miriam is going to tell you in her own words a little bit about her journey towards safer shores. So in speaking out about human rights abuse around the world, I find that the term refugee, it commonly elicits a sense of vulnerability and compassion in audiences. But the term immigrant doesn't always do the same. Yet there's so rarely an acknowledgement of the fact that one is only a refugee after first being an immigrant. Even in stories on the Syrian refugee crisis, which we're all familiar with in our news cycle, we never hear about this transition. In reality, the vast majority of those arriving on European shores have paid smugglers to help them cross borders illegally in hopes of being able to apply for refugee status once they make it to the EU. The UN's rejection rate for Middle Eastern applicants last year was 28%, meaning that 72% of those who survived their journeys were given refugee status. In comparison, the UN's rejection rate for sub-Saharan African applicants last year, for that really small percentage of them who evaded guards when they were crawling over the fences or who survived these crossings over the Mediterranean at night, the rejection rate was 92%. This means that 8% of those are given the chance to rebuild their lives on safer shores. This far exceeds the rejection rate in any other world region. In my research, I argue that the criminalization of blackness, and especially of young black males like Bambino, on a global scale, it's made it virtually impossible for them to plead their cases of vulnerability. In the global community, young black males are not seen as vulnerable subjects, regardless of the conditions that they're fleeing. Skin color is determining the application of our international laws. The first step to change is us first recognizing that this problem exists in the first place, and as someone who's regularly at the table at international debates on human rights, at the UN, I can tell you that race is never a part of the discussion. In the final portion of the presentation, I'm going to ask you all to do me a favor. You should have been handed a card by one of my amazing interns. If you were not, put your hand up and they'll make sure that you get one. So it looks like we have 3 or 4 people. Does someone want to run and get Adama? Oh, there she is. Does someone want to get cards to those folks? So you have a card. If you turn your card over, you'll notice that there's a number that's been handwritten on the back of it. I want everyone to take a look at that number, and if you're able, please stand up out of your seats right now. What's the number? Will you check what it is exactly? $45. Okay, perfect. Thanks. I have to know the number or the activity doesn't work. Okay. So I'd like everyone to wake up. I know it's late on a Tuesday night. And take a look around the room. This room right now is full of your family members. It's full of your neighbors and your closest friends. It's full of people you'd never met before, but after everything that you've endured together in the past months, you see everyone standing next to you as your brother or your sister. It's been exactly 3 months since you left home, and you're coming from all across the continent. You've traveled an average of 3,000 miles. You're exhausted. You've traveled not by plane or even by boat, but by foot and hiding in the backs of overcrowded trucks across sweltering hot deserts. You've fled war and extreme poverty, the kind that Warsan Shire told us about at the beginning of the evening. You've fled places that no longer resembled the communities you once called home. Over 50% of you, so this entire half of the room right here, you're all under the age of 18, and you're traveling on your own. Now look around the room one last time, and if the number on the back of your card is between 1 and 12, I'd like you to take a seat. Those 12 are the ones in your group who won't make it the next 24 hours. You are among the masses who lose your lives every day attempting to escape. Just in the time since I had my most recent cards printed, which was a couple of months ago, this number has risen to 20 people every single day. If the number on the back of your card is between 13 and 35, I'd like you to take your seat. Those are the ones in your group who will never escape North Africa. You're not going to lose your lives in the next 24 hours, but you will lose your lives trapped between the countries you are fleeing and the new homes that you are seeking. Now, if the number on the back of your card is between, what was the last number I just read? Is between 36 and 42, I'd like you to take your seats. Those are some of the very fortunate few in your group. Those ones will make it to mainland Europe. They will set foot on European soil. But they won't get refugee status there. What this means is that for the rest of their lives, they'll live as undocumented migrants. They'll be unable to attend school or access health care. They'll be working under exploitative conditions in agricultural fields and restaurant kitchens. But all that really matters to them is that they won't ever get to see their families again. Their status means that they can't return to their home countries, and they also can't bring their family members to reunite with them in Europe. Those few of you who are left standing, about 5 of you in the room, you can take your seats. You represent the small percentage in your group who will receive refugee status in Europe. You are the dream that everyone else in this room left home for. You are the 8% who survive and rebuild the lives that were lost in the burning. This final clip that I'm going to screen tonight will allow you to hear one more of the courageous voices behind this film. This is 16-year-old Ori, and he and I are going to take you with us out on a boat to experience a Mediterranean crossing firsthand. So that was from one of 3 crossings that I did on the Mediterranean. That particular one was the most treacherous because none of us had any way to communicate with rescue boats. Now that you've had the chance to visualize what the scale of this crisis would be if it were to happen here in our own community, and to imagine what it might be like to spend 3 full days and nights on the freezing Mediterranean in January as the people around you died, I want to ask everyone here in this room if you'll commit to helping me and Bambino and Ori and Miriam share the untold story of Africa's migrant and refugee crisis, so it is not an untold story anymore. Yes? I spend most of my time these days traveling, trying to spread awareness about this issue, and it's hard to do on my own. So tonight, if I leave this talk, I've had the enormous privilege of being able to share this story with 48 new men and women who are committing to be part of this voice with me. But with your help, I can leave tonight having reached not 48 people, but 48 communities of people. So right now, at the end of the evening, I'd like to ask everyone to take out your cell phone. I know you all have them on you. And take a picture right now, before you forget, of the fact on the front of your card. There are different facts circulating around the room. Will you commit to sharing this fact with your community in the next 24 hours? And you can do that in whatever way feels comfortable for you. I think this is one of the few positive uses of social media. It allows you to access a broad community, share this fact, encourage your friends and your family to share it further. You can bring it into a class discussion this week, you can text it to your friends, you can email it, but make sure that this fact leaves the room with you and reaches at least one more person. Secondly, I encourage you all to check out the website for the project, which is smallworldfilms.org. You can learn about other ways to get involved in the work that we're doing here in the community, and you can make a donation to the project because we're still working to raise money to bring it to completion. This film is just one small part of a larger initiative that includes a book, an international human rights educational tour that brings this into classrooms in high schools and colleges across the US, and an effort to establish the first official camp for the world's largest population of migrants and refugees in North Africa. You might think that the $10 that you're going to spend on lunch or a coffee tomorrow doesn't make a difference, but it does. This is a passion project for me, and I've only been able to do this because individual people have made donations to the work that I'm doing. My average donation has been less than $50, and I've been able to get this far. Very last thing, as you all leave tonight, you're going to have the chance to leave a message for the community that's trapped on the other side of the world. So one of the things that's been hardest for me as I've started to tour with this project is that I have the enormous privilege of connecting it to audiences like this and to seeing the impact that these stories have. But Miriam and Ori and Bambino, they can't be here to see this themselves. And the same way it's hard for us to know what 68.6 million people looks like, it's really difficult for Bambino to know what it is to have a classroom full of 48 people who came together to listen to his story tonight. But he understands images. It allows you to communicate with him across linguistic barriers. So I ask everyone as they leave to take just a minute to stand at one of the booths my interns have set up out there and light a match. And the match communicates a couple of things. It allows you to say to this community, I see you, I hear you, and I stand in solidarity with you. At the end of the week, I compile all of the images from the talks that I've done, and I send it to their camps there. One of the weird things about the world today is that despite the fact that they're trapped in camps in North Africa, people have cell phones and communicate with Facebook and WhatsApp. So I encourage you to take just a minute to light a match for the community as you're walking out. I'm going to be here. I'm happy to answer questions if people want to stick around and ask them. For those of you who have to head out, I am so, so grateful for you being here tonight. I thank you for taking the time to join us and to listen to these stories, and I hope that you will consider yourself a part of this movement moving forward. Thank you. Okay.
So let's take a little bit of time. If anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to make, we have a little bit of time before we shut things down. Anybody?
Yeah, this was excellent presentation. I did want to say that You know, in the United States, the 10 richest people in the country have as much money as the 1 billion poorest people on the planet. And they can't take their money with them when they die. And the other fact is that $1.3 trillion a year is spent on wars, where strangers kill strangers. And they're good people in every country, every culture. And I think as a planet, if we can all be compassionate, as you are, it would be a different planet. And I was fortunate to go to Kenya and meet the Maasai. And I found that their culture was the best culture I've ever experienced. Nobody was homeless. Everybody took care of everybody. And I'd love to see, I had written a book relating to the Maasai and another book relating called Doc Hollywood that Warner Brothers made $22 million off of. And it would be wonderful to see a movie about the Maasai and that culture made, and all the money from it to go to this effort, because it's not highlighting us as a country and being perfect, because we surely aren't. We do. But it's highlighting a village, a small group of people in Kenya who I think have the morals that all of us should follow.
Thank you.
I think the wonderful thing about this project is it allows everyone to have a name and a face and a story that you put with these numbers. And with these news stories you're reading every day, they're so dehumanizing. They tell us that just this past week, 117 drowned in the Mediterranean, and not a single report gives us a single name. Who were those people? We think about how we report tragedy in other parts of the world, and we never strip them of their dignity the way we do in this crisis. So, also, if anyone has a connection to one of the 10 richest people, I'm happy to take donations.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation and for bringing feelings and waking us up on this Tuesday evening in Atlanta, Georgia. Really appreciate it. My question is, how do you personally deal with recognizing your privilege when you're in these communities and being a person who really cares about the stories? How does it feel to take out a camera in these moments? And does it ever make you feel like perhaps you're taking away from the story by bringing out a camera? Or does it amplify the story because you're bringing out a camera? How do the friends that you've made in these communities, how do they view it when you take out the camera?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I could have a whole nother lecture series on. So to address it quickly, I actually just last night was talking to a friend about professors about recognizing the privilege that I stand in, that probably a lot of us gathered in this room stand in, and how you can use that. And in the spaces that I work, the fact that I'm coming in as an outsider, as a white woman, as an American woman, as a young woman, all of these things have worked to my advantage in terms of gaining access to certain spaces and certain individuals. And so that feels like one way that I'm able to use the privilege that I have to elevate voices of people who I don't think have them. But that being said, it's very important to me that the project feels like it's distributed equally among all of us. So as a filmmaker, I practice what we call community filmmaking, meaning that every one of the subjects of the film is an active creative voice, not just a subject. So they are often holding the cameras themselves. They have control over the way that they want their story to be told. And they have as much ownership and also, at this point, pride in the project as I do. So because I had worked in this space for so long, I was able to work with subjects who I already had long-standing relationships with. So I mean, Fino I'd known for 10 years when we started filming. And so they very much knew what the project was about and were part of designing it with me from the beginning and continue to be part of designing the social impact campaign around it. There are some whose voices we carry forward because they're no longer with us. So of the 3 families that I've been following, every single one of them lost at least one member over the course of filming. Bambino, Alsani Diallo, the boy who you all were introduced to, is one of them who's gone. And so for all of us, we now carry this enormous privilege of being able to share Bambino's story with the world, knowing that if we don't, no one will ever know that he existed.
Hello, thank you very much for the film. I'm from Kenya, so this story really, I care about it so deeply. You mentioned that when you go to the world organizations, that the race is not even discussed. And my question is, why are they not open to discussing it and looking for solutions?
So I actually, on March 8th, I'll be speaking at the UN about this project in a continual effort to get people to introduce race into the dialogue. So increasingly, we have conversations about gender and about age and how those categories determine people's vulnerability under international law. And so why that has been such a challenge, I'm not sure that I have the answer. I think that anything that is going to push for more acceptance, for higher quotas, is going to have pushback from countries that are deeply invested in keeping borders tight. As we all know, there's a growing tide of nationalism around the world, and this is certainly a part of it. But I think at the root of it, we need to think about, is everyone, regardless of where they're born, regardless of their race, their age, their gender, deserving of the same basic human rights? And if so, then it really needs to be a process that's determined without consideration for those factors. Someone fleeing an active war in the DRC who's a 16-year-old boy or a 16-year-old girl, you know, neither one is any more or less safe in that space. So,
One more question or comment? Yeah.
Hi. I echo previous participants. It was a really amazing, very touching and compelling presentation. My question is, what are the most sort of thorny ethical questions that you face as an anthropologist and as a filmmaker in doing this project?
So many. So I think the question that you highlighted earlier about when you hold the camera up and when you take the camera down. And for me, that decision has a lot to do with how much of a creative collaboration you feel that you've built with your subjects, and if you're serving well a story that they're equally invested in telling. But there are certainly moments with this project in particular when I question how I can best serve. And so moments where people are facing life and death, you have to ask yourself if you feel like you have the ability to intervene and to stop that. And if not, then is the next best thing to document that it's happening in the first place. And so, the best examples of that I can think of are cases in detention centers where people are being beaten to death, where I am also being beaten. I don't have the ability to stop what's happening to the individuals there, but I have the ability to document it. On the counter side, there's the example of Kia, the young mother who you saw with the 2 children. And she had a son, her son Mo, who needed a surgery. And he wasn't able to get the surgery done in Morocco because no doctors would provide him with the service there. Not because they're bad people, because they were also scared of going against the mandate of the state. It's a military police state. And so even me as a foreigner, a white woman with cash in hand, going hospital to hospital, no one would provide the service for Mo. But we were told that he needed it and that it was critical. And so at that moment I thought, I can do nothing, right? And I can let the story unfold as it would naturally unfold if I was not here in this scene, right? And in some ways, that's truer to the experience of migrants who are trapped in that space. Most of them do not have a filmmaker traveling with them with the ability to intervene when there's a medical crisis, right? But I also have to live with myself and the fact that I have genuine relationships with these individuals and I am interjected in their lives. So the alternative was to send him back home where I knew that he would be able to get the procedure. But I can't buy a plane ticket for Kia and Mo, so it means that I'm paying for them to go on a reverse smuggling route along a really treacherous route through Algeria and northern Mali, which is now under the control of jihadist camps. There are a million things that could happen to them on that route. That was sort of a high point of ethical quandaries on this project. I decided to send them back home. I went with them. We traveled together back to Mali. We made it safely. He got the procedure. He's okay now. But it could have not turned out like that. Right? And there were a lot of moments in the project where it is life and death, and you are, for better or worse, interjected in the lives of the individuals whose stories you're telling. And so, you know, I tell my students, I think it's something you figure out for yourself. I don't think there's a rule book. Any last question? Yeah. It's really hard to come by statistics in this space because all of the major NGOs that were on the ground have been thrown out, and the only people there in this space now are affiliated with the Moroccan government. So I have done some pretty large-scale surveys for my research in this space before I started the film project that was collecting, you know, raw numbers on where people are coming from, age, gender, nationality, but you know, it's very limited. The numbers are scant. You know, just by being in the space that we're talking about hundreds of thousands. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, people are moving all the time, and you know, I've thought about how much more difficult and potentially impossible this project would have been just 5 years ago, because there wouldn't have been the access to cell phones in those communities that there is now. And so people are communicating by Facebook Messenger and by WhatsApp, and people have, usually within a large community, access to one phone at any given time between them. And even though the phones are being stolen all the time by raiding forces, it's easy enough to get another one and to log in. So one phone will be shared between a camp of 100 to 300 people, and they're logging in. And so I'm communicating with people, you know, through Messenger. I'm finding them through Messenger. Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you all again. I really appreciate you being here. Please take a second to light a match on your way out. I'm happy to hang around if folks want to come up and ask more questions.
Thank you. That was amazing.